We are taught that the Panama Canal was America's greatest engineering triumph. We are told that American ingenuity conquered disease and geography where the French had failed. We learn about heroic doctors defeating yellow fever and brilliant engineers moving mountains. But this is the sanitized version of history. It ignores the most important question. Why did the French really fail? And more crucially, how did America profit from that failure? If you want to understand how the United States became a global power, how construction disaster became a strategic victory, and how bankruptcy can be more valuable than success, you have to look past the engineering marvel. You have to look at the financial records. The Panama Canal wasn't built by American triumph over French incompetence. It was built on the corpse of the greatest financial fraud in European history. This is the story of how America learned to weaponize other people's failures, one shovel of dirt at a time. The French dream machine. To understand this financial catastrophe, we must travel to Paris in 1879, to the offices of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who had built the Suez Canal and become the most famous engineer in the world. At 74 years old, de Lesseps was a national hero in France. He was the man who had connected East and West, who had made the impossible possible. When he announced his next project, a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, the French public did just believe in him. They worshipped him. The proposed Panama Canal was even more ambitious than Suez. Instead of cutting through flat desert, engineers would have to carve through mountains and jungles. Instead of connecting to seas at the same level, they would have to deal with massive elevation changes. Instead of working in the familiar Mediterranean climate, they would be operating in one of the most disease-ridden environments on Earth. But de Lesseps was confident, and confidence was contagious. He had studied the maps, consulted with engineers, and calculated the costs. The project would take 8 years and cost 600 million francs. It would be difficult, but not impossible. After all, if he could build Suez, he could build anything. The French public agreed. When de Lesseps launched his campaign to raise money for the Panama Canal Company in 1881, it became a national obsession. This wasn't just an investment opportunity. It was a patriotic duty. The canal would cement France's position as the world's leading engineering nation. It would generate enormous profits for French investors. It would be France's gift to global commerce. The subscription drive was unprecedented in scope. De Lesseps didn't just target wealthy investors. He appealed directly to the French middle class through newspaper advertisements, public rallies, and promotional campaigns. Small investors could buy shares for as little as 500 francs. Shopkeepers, teachers, clerks, and retirees scraped together their life savings to participate in the great national project. Within months, over 800,000 French citizens had invested in the Panama Canal Company. Think about that number. In a country of 38 million people, more than 2% of the entire population had put their personal savings into a single construction project on the other side of the world. It was the largest crowdfunding campaign in history, decades before the internet made such things routine. The initial optimism seemed justified. Construction began in 1882 with great French engineers arrived in Panama with the latest excavation equipment. Work camps were established along the proposed route. Progress reports sent back to Paris described steady advancement through the jungle. The shares of the Panama Canal Company rose steadily on the Paris Stock Exchange. But beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding. The engineering nightmare. The reality of construction in Panama was nothing like the projections in de Lesseps. The geography was far more challenging than anticipated. The tropical climate was more brutal than imagined. The disease environment was more deadly than anyone had prepared for. The original plan called for a sea-level canal, similar to Suez. But Panama was not Egypt. The continental divide rose 300 feet above sea level, directly in the path of the proposed canal. The Chagres River, which the canal would have to cross, was prone to devastating floods that could rise 35 feet in a single day. The rock formations were harder than expected, requiring far more explosives and excavation than budgeted. Most catastrophically, the disease burden was apocalyptic. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery ravaged the workforce. French engineers and supervisors died at rates that approached 50% annually. Entire construction crews would be wiped out within months of arrival. The company was forced to recruit new workers constantly, but word of the death rates made recruitment increasingly difficult and expensive. The financial impact of these challenges was immediate and devastating. Construction costs exploded far beyond the original estimates. Equipment that was supposed to last years was destroyed by the tropical climate within months. The constant need to replace dead or departed workers drove labor costs through the roof. The slow pace of actual excavation meant that fixed costs accumulated far longer than projected. By 1885, just 3 years into construction, the Panama Canal Company had already spent nearly 300 million francs, half of the total budget, but had completed less than 10% of the necessary excavation. The sea-level canal that de Lesseps had promised was clearly impossible with the available technology and budget. The company faced a choice: admit failure and face bankruptcy, or double down with a new approach and new funding. De Lesseps chose to double down. He quietly abandoned the sea-level canal design and switched to a lock-based system, similar to what would eventually be built by the Americans. But this change required even more money, more time, and more engineering expertise. To raise additional funds, De Lesseps went back to the French public with a new share offering. But this time the sales pitch was different. Instead of promising quick profits from a straightforward engineering project, he was asking investors to bail out a project that was clearly in trouble. The subscription was less successful than the first, raising only 200 million additional francs. The money was not enough. By 1887, the company was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate, while making minimal progress on actual construction. The financial situation was becoming desperate, but de Lesseps refused to admit defeat. Instead, he turned to the most dangerous financial instrument available: high-yield bonds with lottery features. The financial fraud begins. The lottery bonds that de Lesseps launched in 1888 were a masterpiece of financial engineering designed to separate French citizens from their savings. Unlike regular bonds that paid fixed interest, these securities functioned like a combination of investment and gambling. Bondholders would receive modest interest payments, but they would also be entered into regular lotteries for much larger prizes. The psychological appeal was irresistible. Small investors could tell themselves they were making a responsible investment in a patriotic infrastructure project, while simultaneously dreaming of winning a life-changing lottery prize. The marketing campaign emphasized both the steady returns and the lottery excitement, while downplaying the obvious risks. But the lottery bonds were not just a creative financing scheme. They were the beginning of a systematic fraud that would ultimately destroy the lives of hundreds of thousands of French families. The company was using the new bond proceeds not to advance construction, but to pay interest on previous bonds, and to fund lavish executive compensation. De Lesseps and his associates were living like kings, while their investors' money disappeared into the Panamanian jungle. The company maintained luxurious offices in Paris, paid enormous salaries to and funded a publicity campaign designed to maintain public confidence in the failing project. Meanwhile, actual construction in Panama had slowed to a crawl as the company struggled to pay its workforce and suppliers. The most damaging aspect of the fraud was the systematic deception of investors about the project's true status. Official reports sent to shareholders painted a picture of steady progress and imminent completion. De Lesseps personally appeared at public meetings to reassure investors that the canal would be finished on schedule and would generate the promised returns. In reality, company officials knew by 1888 that the project was financially doomed. Internal documents that would later be discovered by prosecutors showed that the company needed at least 2 billion additional francs to complete the canal, more than triple the original estimated cost. But instead of admitting this to investors, the company continued to raise money through increasingly desperate financing schemes. The end came suddenly in early 1889. The company could no longer meet its payroll in Panama or its bond payments in Paris. Work on the canal stopped entirely as unpaid workers abandoned the construction sites. The stock price, which had been artificially supported through market manipulation, collapsed overnight. On February 4, 1889, the Panama Canal Company declared bankruptcy. The company's liabilities totaled 1.4 billion francs, against assets of perhaps 200 million francs. It was the largest corporate failure in European history, equivalent to a modern bankruptcy of over $50 billion. The human catastrophe. The collapse of the Panama Canal Company sent shockwaves through French society that reverberated for decades. Over 800,000 investors lost their life savings virtually overnight. These were not wealthy speculators who could afford the loss. They were middle-class families who had believed in de Lesseps' vision and their government's implicit endorsement of the project. The human cost was staggering and largely invisible to the outside world. Retirees who had invested their pensions faced destitution. Small business owners who had mortgaged their shops to buy Panama bonds faced bankruptcy. Teachers and civil servants who had carefully saved for their families' futures watched their dreams evaporate. Suicide rates spiked across France as investors realized the full extent of their losses. Families that had been solidly middle class found themselves unable to pay rent or buy food. The psychological trauma of the betrayal was perhaps even more devastating than the financial loss. These investors had trusted France's greatest hero and had been systematically robbed. The political consequences were immediate and severe. The Panama Scandal, as it became known, revealed that numerous French politicians had accepted bribes to support the company's bond offerings. Members of parliament, ministers, and even newspaper editors had been secretly paid to maintain public confidence in the failing project. The scandal destroyed the Third Republic's credibility and fueled anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that would poison French politics for decades. The fact that several of the company's financial advisors were Jewish allowed demagogues to blame the disaster on Jewish financiers, rather than on the structural problems of the project itself. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who had been France's greatest hero, became its most reviled figure. He was prosecuted for fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he died before serving his sentence. His reputation, which had survived the triumphs of Suez, was destroyed forever by the catastrophe of Panama. But the most tragic aspect of the Panama disaster was that it was completely unnecessary. The canal was technically feasible, as the Americans would later prove. The French failure was not due to engineering impossibilities, but to financial mismanagement, systematic fraud, and the unwillingness to admit error and change course. America's strategic patience. While France was convulsing from the Panama scandal, the United States was watching with keen interest. American strategic thinkers had always understood the value of an Isthmian canal, but they had been content to let the French bear the costs and risks of the initial attempt. The American approach to Panama was fundamentally different from the French approach. Where the French had seen an engineering challenge to be overcome through heroic effort, the Americans saw a business problem to be solved through systematic analysis. Where the French had relied on charisma and small investors, the Americans planned to use government resources and professional management. Most importantly, the Americans had learned from French mistakes. They understood that disease was the primary obstacle, not geography. They had studied the French records and concluded that a lock-based canal was the only feasible approach. But the Americans faced a significant obstacle. They didn't control Panama. The Isthmus was a province of Colombia, and the Colombian government had no interest in allowing the United States to build a canal under American control. The French failure created an opportunity for American intervention. The American strategy unfolded in stages between 1898 and 1904. First, the U.S. government negotiated to purchase the French company's assets and canal rights for $40 million, less than 3% of what the French had invested. Second, the Americans encouraged and supported a Panamanian independence movement that would create a more compliant government. When Colombia rejected American terms, American agents began working with Panamanian separatists to organize a rebellion. The Panamanian Revolution of 1903 was not a popular uprising. It was a carefully orchestrated regime change operation designed to install a government that would accept American terms. The revolution succeeded because American warships prevented Colombian forces from reaching Panama. Third, the new Panamanian government immediately signed the Habu-Navarilla Treaty, which gave the United States unprecedented control over a 10-mile-wide canal zone in perpetuity. The terms were so favorable to the Americans that the Panamanian negotiator later admitted he had essentially given away his country's sovereignty. The American construction miracle, the American construction effort that began in 1904, was a masterpiece of organization, engineering, and public health. Unlike the French, the Americans approached Panama as a systematic challenge, requiring coordinated solutions. The first priority was disease control. The Americans understood that yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes. Under Dr. William Gorgas, American forces launched a comprehensive campaign to eliminate mosquito breeding grounds throughout the canal zone. Within 2 years, yellow fever had been eliminated from the canal zone, and malaria rates had dropped dramatically. The death rate among American workers was a fraction of what the French had experienced. The engineering approach was equally systematic. Instead of trying to build a sea-level canal, the Americans designed a lock system that would lift ships 85 feet above sea level. This approach required less excavation than the French plan while providing better flood control. Between 1904 and 1914, American forces excavated more material than the French had in their entire 8-year effort. The canal was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, opening to commercial traffic on August 15, 1914. The French asset strategy. The most revealing aspect of the American success was how effectively they monetized the French failure. The $40 million that the United States paid for the French assets was one of the greatest bargain purchases in history. For that modest sum, the Americans acquired engineering studies worth tens of millions of dollars, excavation work that would have cost hundreds of millions to duplicate, and construction equipment that was still valuable despite years in the tropical climate. They also gained legal rights and precedents that would have been expensive and time-consuming to establish from scratch. Think about the economics of this transaction. The French had invested 1.4 billion francs and had completed perhaps 15% of the necessary work before bankruptcy. The Americans paid $40 million for this 15% completion, then spent an additional $375 million to finish the remaining 85%. Their total cost was $415 million for a project that had cost the French over $700 million in comparable currency, while remaining incomplete. But the financial advantage was only part of the story. The Americans had also learned from every French mistake without paying for those lessons themselves. They knew which approaches had failed, which suppliers were unreliable, which engineering solutions were impractical. They had 8 years of expensive French experimentation to guide their own planning. The French failure had also solved several political problems for the Americans. The bankruptcy had discredited the idea of private canal construction, making government involvement seem necessary. The human tragedy had made the French public hostile to any revival of the Panama Project, eliminating potential competition. The scandal had weakened France's international influence, reducing their ability to oppose American intervention in Panama. Most importantly, the French disaster had demonstrated that canal construction was too risky and complex for private investment, justifying the American decision to treat it as a government project with strategic rather than purely commercial objectives. The modern parallel. The Panama Canal strategy established a template that the United States would use repeatedly, allow competitors to exhaust themselves on impossible challenges, then step in to acquire their assets and complete their objectives on favorable terms. This pattern can be seen in American responses to European colonial exhaustion after both World Wars, and in the peaceful absorption of Soviet technological assets after 1991. Look at modern technology markets, and you see the same dynamic. American companies often avoid being first to market with new technologies, preferring to let others establish proof of concept. Then they enter with superior execution, acquiring failed competitors' assets while building on their research. The lesson of Panama is that timing is often more important than innovation. The French were more innovative and ambitious, but they paid the price of being first. The Americans were more patient and strategic, and they reaped the rewards of being second. The Panama Canal stands today as one of the most successful infrastructure projects in history, but it was built in the corpse of French dreams and French savings. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from overcoming your own challenges, but from capitalizing on your competitors' failures. The 800,000 French investors who lost their savings never saw a franc of return on their investment, but their sacrifice funded the engineering studies and construction experience that made American success possible. They paid for America's triumph with their ruined lives. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tallies channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. The next great project failure is already beginning somewhere in the world, and understanding how winners emerge from losers' ashes will help you recognize the patterns before they repeat.